Hello, we're the team from the first graduation performance. This December, we'll be bringing you the stage adaptation of High School Musical, which is called Youth Melody. But before that, we'll have some questions that we would like to ask about. For example, there are many ways to showcase our English learning achievements, so why does it have to be through graduation performance? So today, we are really happy to invite Pavlos, one of the students. No, not students.
Used to be.
Yeah, one of the teachers in our university's language center. Pavlos has held our graduation performance for several years, providing great assistance in script writing and rehearsals. I also heard that his PhD in UK was in drama, literature, and stage design. So today we are going to have a conversation with him about some questions that different students might have when it comes to graduation performance.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Puff, and nice to meet you again. And time flies, I'm more than happy to see you bustling again on the graduation show this year.
Hi Puff, thank you for accepting our interview. So our first question today is actually quite short, but it's one that many different students have been wondering for years. Okay, so our first question is, we study literature and linguistics in the foreign languages department,
Right.
but drama is actually a different field. So why is it something that we as university students are expected to complete?
Okay, so are you sure to wish to start by these top questions? Well, to answer this question, I guess we have to have a consensus on what literature is actually about. Okay, but I noticed that when we talk about literatures, we automatically remove or excel everything except words. I think the main reason probably may caused by the text or the poetry or some kind of written text are the primary teaching materials we use in teaching since in elementary school. That makes us to believe that when literature is related to something else, that must be related to words.
That's a valid point. Many people do have that instinctive association with literature. But how do you see drama fitting into that definition?
Well, I think the assumption to distinguish it from the drama from literature is actually a very dangerous thing, especially when this assumption might be both yes and no. And these two categories actually have very totally different ways of expressing themselves. For example, for words, for written text, the way they express themselves might be using symbols, signs, syntax, whatever you've learned in defaults. And when you talk about drama or performances, we're actually looking at something like gestures or body languages, or even the motion on the stage may cause crucial effects. One example I may mention is like in a very famous movie you probably be familiar with quite a lot, that the Devil Wears Prada, in which Miranda was saying something like quite often iconic expressions like "that's all."
That's all.
Union, which exposed the
That's all.
exploitation.
That's all. That's all. That's all. That's all. That's all.
That's all was like so simple words, doesn't mean anything if we use written words, but through actor or actress's performances, that three words become vividly expressing some kind of sneering or and sarcasms or some whatever. So that's the things that these two genre or two categories may differ.
Okay, so you're suggesting that drama is just as valid as written literature in expressing literary themes, or maybe like can convey more things rather than like.
I personally think that you should be more careful about when you use a comparative grammar to describe these two things, especially when I personally think that they are different, but there is no such a thing called superior or inferior. And I also recommend that even though that the drama has a very strong emotions in expressions because it's closer proximities to the audience, like you just perform in front of them, but that doesn't mean that you perform better or effectively, especially when that kind of expressions is highly close, highly relevant to the actress's ability. But I can tell you one story that happened a few years ago in my PhD learning, that once I tried to claim to my supervisor saying that I think prose, the essays, perform better than poetry. And I didn't expect that kind of things, that kind of conclusions irritated her. She was a very calm and peaceful lady, but she was angry saying that this is a very crude and rough decision you make. So I think that different genres has its own unique way of expressions, and they are both powerful.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, I think I just understand half of your points. So half of it is that, as you just mentioned, literature can be presented in many different forms, just like films, book exhibition, and even student-initiated magazines. But before we conduct this interview, we did some simple research and was surprised to find that almost all foreign languages department in Taiwan have graduation performance that function simply to thesis. So is it just simply because that it is a more performative way or performative form of narrative?
I personally think that the reasons might be many, but one of those could be that because drama or performances are rather more presentable or more festival, that Taiwanese people like the party ways of expressions, and I'm not saying that the university in foreign countries doesn't have that habits, but actually they have something quite unique and different, that since they're high school or even younger, they already involve playing or expressions on stages into their own culture. So it's quite kind of invert ways of expressions. So for them, they might not consider that graduation shows as a necessary part of their study, or need to be like large scale. I've ever seen one very unique and special shows that one students in the universities in the UK were acting like play simultaneously like 4 to 6 characters on one wooden boxes for 15 minutes, and that show was like stunning. So but yeah, I think it's quite true that Taiwanese universities and students favor graduation show as a kind of assessment of outcome of their studies in university, simply because every department in Taiwanese universities normally have a kind of graduation project, but we don't. Okay, so rather we choose another alternative by playing the kind of carnival ways of like rituals to celebrate this very important end of the university life.
Okay, so could you perhaps give some examples of works that illustrate the connection of performance and literature?
Examples? Well, yeah, I think if you want today, just because it's quite meaningful to mention about this today, especially when today is the U.S.'s presidential election.
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
I don't know who wins, but you can tell that this year, especially this year, the issue of fake news or manipulation of mass media or some kind of surveillance are very well talked and discussed issues among populations. Okay, so I can if I were to give any examples in relation to this, then the conference rag in Chicago, the very famous music, which won the Oscar in 2003, was quite iconic to mention. and in which the lawyer Billy Flynns were some kind of try to purify his client Roxy's murder scene into a naive and self-defense kind of acts. So probably you can have later you can attach some sort of different scenes from that. You can see how vivid that the puppet has been controlled or be washed on stage rather than the truth.
When'd you get here?
1920.
How old were you?
Don't remember.
Then what happened?
I met Amos and he stole my heart away. Convinced me to elope one day.
How you feeling?
Very frightened.
Are you sorry? You keep kidding. What's your statement?
All I say is, oh my choo-choo jump the truck. I give my life to bring it back. Stay away from acid and liquor. And the men who pay for fun. That's the thought that you cannot find me. Hey, folks, reach for the gun.
거의
어린 출신 미시시시 음원들은 완전 그저 어디 계셔 무덤 속에 어느 새로운 기회 찾아와 난 수녀원에 갔었죠 시카고 번째 1920년 그때 몇 살 기억 안나 그따그래 에이머스 만나 사랑에 훅 빠져서 야반도주 결혼했죠
A powerful choice for students to explore. Are there any other examples you could share, especially from your or our own department's past performances?
Sure. Yeah, just I mentioned Chicago wasn't something that is high and incredible to mimic. Actually, just about 10 years ago, our department, like defaults in Jinan, were casting Chicago,
Oh, really?
and that was quite successful, especially that iconic scenes on the stage.
Right.
But if you want me to give you a more recent one, then I will mention the Hairspray adaptations like 2 years ago. I remember the names were like Where I Wanna Be,
Yeah,
okay?
I know that.
In which, because that's quite meaningful to mention, especially when that movie was originally talking about the racial discriminations and some other sensitive questions that not familiar to Taiwanese students, so especially when we don't encounter, there is no occurrence in Taiwan in that issues lately. And there will be even ridiculous if we try to imitate everything by, like, for example, paint students in black and ask them to perform callings or whatever. Okay. So I think that would be ridiculous if we do that. We're just doing something exactly the same from Junkao shows. Junkao was actually a play when I remember it's in about 80s, 30s when Americans want to laugh on black people. They try to use white people to costume as a black one and to make very exaggeration behaviors, and that would be not appropriate to do that.
Okay, so it is sure an important point about cultural sensitivity in adaptation. So how did your department handle that challenge when adapting Hairspray?
Well, they do some changes, I think, but the most important part is there's a term called cultural or a performance appropriation, meaning we borrow the cultures from some other sources. And to deal with that, the students in 2 years ago were changing a little bit the playwright into a girl was looking for the self-identities and how to tackle with the school bullying or something like that, because those are the questions or the issues we are more familiar with. Yeah. So I think that was a quite successful adaptation, though doesn't make the play wasn't so similar to the original ones. But yeah, I think that's also our rights to reinterpret whatever that kind of performances
Sure.
tend to express. Yeah.
Okay. Since you've mentioned the musical adaptation from Hairspray 2 years ago, what are your thoughts on this year's adaptation of High School Musical, especially since you are directly involved into the script revisions?
Okay, that's a quite interesting question because before this talk, I've been hearing people saying that like adapting some sort of a product and make it into another was a sin, but actually I would like to say something different because I've been reading watching your practice, and I've been reading your playwright. I noticed that you actually doing something called nostalgia, which means that you collect those meaningful to your generations and perform and make it into a package. And that's quite interesting, especially when your generations or my generations, when we gathering enough content from our cultures, we can reunite them and try to make them into a new whole, and that's a process of creation.
Yes.
And I think you just done great because you actually expressing yourself by demonstrate what songs, those Westlife or whatever stuffs are meaningful for you, and that's quite some sort of behavior that was of encouraging.
Okay, thank you. So I have one more question, and this one is more related to the broader environment. We're now living in an era where both the form and platform of communication have shifted. While the younger generation is still torn between short videos and more traditional forms like drama or literary works, our surroundings are increasingly filled with instant or packaged information. I've heard that some schools are gradually abandoning the tradition of graduation performance. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I believe that actually this is quite serious questions I want to bring up, especially when I read a book called Dopamine Nation, which has been written by Dr. Anna Lemke. I believe she was a neuroscientist. Okay, the book was mentioned a very important brain chemical called dopamine, which is one of the 4 happy hormones in our brain. And actually, the reason I mention this is because when we are saying something like we no more need happiness, or we search happiness as a quick shift, that means that we are whenever we're doing this, we are making happiness cheaper. Okay, and the businessman knows this better than we do. And so in this era of smartphones and quick and instant happiness or gratifications, I have to say happy or feeling happy becoming rather vulgar.
That's kind of interesting. When you say happiness has become vulgar, become cheap, could you elaborate on what you mean? Why you're talking about that?
Yeah. That's a very nice question to talk about, because the most remarkable parts when the Dr. Lemke was mentioned in her book was actually, it turns out it made me firstly realize that we are bodily not designed as a kind of creature to immerse in happiness.
Yes.
Whatever we do, like nowadays, we try to fulfill a task. We try to get high grades in every single exams. Whatever challenges that make us thrilled and excited, we're set up the goal to gathering more dopamines after things. But human beings are not created with that many happiness, especially when there is a very crucial facts and crucial, and I always say crucial and cruel facts that actually our brains, okay, and the dopamine and the happiness and the pain are actually produced in the same part of our brain. Meaning, when you gather in a certain amount of happiness, you will get certain amount of pain in return. And that was quite shocking because, there's the facts. I wouldn't say it's politically correct to say that, but you can imagine watching 90 seconds of shorts will produce the quite same amounts of dopamine as you have a wonderful sex. So that's quite instant and unearned because you simply sit there and watch your shorts.
Yes.
So that's the problem.
Okay, so that's actually a fascinating concept. So in a sense, the pursuit of constant pleasure could lead to an imbalance in our lives. Do you think that this is particularly amplified by the digital age with platforms like TikTok or something else?
Yeah. It's quite meaningful to mention TikTok.
Yeah.
Nowadays the question that's being raised is that why is it so often to see people committed suicide, or the proportions of people who get depressions is getting higher compared to the past. One of the reasons is just what I mentioned. There's a balancing mechanism between pleasure and pain in our brain. So if we overtaken so many pleasures, that it means that we have. That doesn't mean that we will given more pain. No, but when you are facing the same amount of pain, you will actually your brain will automatically exaggerate or to take serious on every single frustrations you face in the society. That's why many people call Generation Z the generation of strawberry, because they think they are fragile to the challenges or whatever.
Yes,
so that's the problem, because TikTok, regardless its highly addictive feature, the most important part of this, the real threat of this is that this generation is inevitably a race of gratification and instant gratification. So we are highly addicted to happiness, and we are crazed on that.
Yeah, okay, so I think that is a really powerful point. So I still have some more questions, like if we move away from these traditions, we might not be able to bring them back. So what are your thoughts on the continuation of these performances in schools, especially considering that some institutions might be phasing them out?
Right. Answering these questions, I tend to be rather not too optimistic or pessimistic, because the truth is that they might be happening that maybe in 10 or 20 years there are no more graduation show on earth. But the true power of the theaters or the performers is that they use a very basic, very primitive ways of our body or organs to perform our expressions, express our emotions or our stories. So the storytelling process is somehow not replaceable on that kind of cheap things. I mean, TikTok stuff. But the truth is, just like you just been practicing dancing or acting, like you spend incredibly huge time on practicing the show, simply because for that 90 minutes of performances on December. Okay, but not everyone will like to perform that kind of thing. Not everyone. Okay, so there's a chance that maybe like in 5 years, more pessimistically, but for your generations, maybe in 10 years, maybe in the student reunion, like in 20 years, okay, you may meet each other on the party and says, oh, we have a collective memories that is sweet, and that won't be replaced easily.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really profound. So it's a reminder of how valuable these experiences are to us or to some like students of our age, so both culturally and personally. So thank you for sharing this insights. Any final words for our students preparing for this year's graduation performance?
Okay, I'm more than happy, once again, more than happy to chat with you. And the very best, all the best wish for you to have a groovy graduation show. And maybe you can click here or there for more information about our shows. And see you on December. See you in December. Sorry. See you in December. When?
December the 5th and December the 7th.
Okay, so see you then. Bye.
See you then. Bye.